Commissar Dracy on Twitter has an open letter to Games Workshop asking for a very reasonable request that they hire a sensitivity reader to go over stuff before it goes to print and hopefully ensure that we don't have to deal with another big blow up like this. I think it's a super reasonable ask, and I think you should consider signing the open letter as well. Also, to those of you who just started typing angry comments, hold off. I'm sure I'll piss you off more in a few minutes, and I don't want to have to delete multiple comments from you, so buckle up. Hey there, scabby scummers and gangers, Crimson Oracle here. This video isn't one that I was planning to make, but there's been an extended argument about the topic of female space marines since this passage got published in the new Horus Heresy book. The process by which space marines are created relies inherently on the hormonal and biological makeup of the human male, meaning that only males can be subjected to the transformation. Now, this is hardly the first time the topic of space marines being male only has come up. In fact, discourse about female space marines has existed as a kind of background conflict simmering in the 40k fandom for pretty much the entire time I've been involved in the hobby. There's a lot of crosstalk, and it happens to be that I think it's time for me to weigh in. Maybe it's the fact that I've been through hormone therapy. Maybe it's the fact that I just got an awesome set of hand-sculpted pewter female space marines from Art Studios. Maybe it's the sheer nastiness of some of the people I've seen arguing about it. But goddammit, I'm plowing into this controversial topic. I'll just state my case up front because the rest of this video is largely dealing with the arguments I disagree with to one degree or another. I think Warhammer 40k is a setting designed around allowing a huge amount of creativity and freedom for the players. The background of the game should be written in a way that maximizes player creativity. This includes things like reasons for internal fighting among factions, and it definitely includes allowing players the freedom to make the central, iconic figures in the setting, arguably its most well-known and defining feature, men and women. This is in part about making a better hook that will catch more people, as we see has been working in Age of Sigmar, but it's also just kind of a first principle for me. If something doesn't have a really clear reason to work a different way, why not let players make the choice themselves? The other reason is in a similar vein. It's a creative hobby, and more freedom means more opportunities to create cool works of art. And my final reason is simply that I think it would be an interesting topic that would give us new avenues to explore different ideas. And let's face it, Space Marines are one of the least interesting of all the factions. They just don't have that much going on. They are kind of boring. Anything that can breathe life into the well-trod subject of Space Marines would be appreciated, Primaris notwithstanding. And, of course, the fact is the flagship faction being a boys-only club really just feels dated in 2022. And that's before we consider the not-so-great logic behind it. If you're hearing this thinking, I'm not sure this is really an open and shut case for changing the background, keep in mind that for the longest time, I've been ambivalent about Games Workshop making an official change on this subject. Mostly because I worry about how they'll handle it, and because I don't really think Games Workshop gets to dictate what we do with their story. It is, after all, us who are telling it. More importantly, I think the arguments against this retcon or new lore or whatever it would be just aren't very good. But that's why we're here, right? But of course, as always, it's important to start with some background. The reason there aren't female space marines has nothing to do with lore or background or character of marines. It's to do with simple logistics of making miniatures and selling miniatures. Early Citadel ranges had female versions of most character types. In fact, when we produced the C range, the intention was that upwards of 25% of all the models would be female. But when we started selling the first fully formed C code, which was CO1 fighters, retailers kept complaining to us that customers weren't buying the female models, and could we not include any in their restocks. So we took the female models out of circulation. I simply didn't include the molds in the production cycle. It wasn't the only example, and so we pretty much stopped any thoughts of doing massive ranges of female wizards, etc. This was in the early to mid-80s. Citadel customers at the time made it clear to us that they weren't interested in buying female models. So when we get to the new Rogue Trader ranges and exciting new Space Marine ranges, it's difficult to see how we could logistically add in an occasional female to the mix. Blister packs had 3 Marines in them at the time, and the days of huge random mixes were long gone. And we knew that if every Marine blister had a female model as one of the 3 Marines, that folks would complain. So we didn't make any female ones except for the very occasional ones that pop up from time to time. All the background fluff about why there are only male Marines is there to justify a commercial logistics issue. BTW, the success of the Plastic Marines RTB01 set also played a part. It never occurred to us to make any of those models female, and it certainly wouldn't have been possible to make it so there were 2 or 3 in the box. That set to a large degree defined what Marines were. So, it's now fairly well known thanks to a Bell of Lost Souls article that included the previous post from former GW staffer Alan Merritt, but female Space Marines were originally part of the planned rollout of Rogue Trader. Games Workshop created Warhammer 40k as a sci-fi version of Warhammer Fantasy, itself a sort of less austere take on Lord of the Rings and Dungeons & Dragons, which the company had been making miniatures for initially, as well as serving as the UK distributor. The Citadel Miniatures line was relatively new, and, per Alan Merritt, they initially were producing female versions of most of their character types. But the people buying minis in the early to mid-80s weren't buying them in enough quantities for retailers to want to keep stocking them. As a result, Citadel scaled back production of female models, and while they might have originally wanted to include female Space Marines in their lineup, making 1/3 of their 3-pack blisters of metal models female was likely to result in complaints. Add in the crucial role the original Plastic Space Marines set played in launching Warhammer 40k, and it's a recipe for an all-male faction. There were stories about female Marines in publications outside of Games Workshop, as for a long time GW actually allowed third parties to publish and profit from materials related to their games. Imagine that. Little Sisters of Purification, a chapter of female Space Marines that wears black armor and swears vows of chastity, humility, and honor to the Emperor, were one of these. There was also art of a woman in armor executing a Marine in the Rogue Trader book itself, though she was not explicitly labeled a female Space Marine and would later be retconned to become a Sister of Battle. Of course, Space Marines at the time also weren't quite Space Marines. They were essentially just humans in heavier armor. 2 female Space Marine models were sculpted. They're very rare now, but they were sold as Female Warrior Jane and Female Warrior Gabs rather than marketed as Space Marines. Rogue Trader was a very rough version of the background. Space Marines were an elite military force, but they weren't the mythological figures that they would become. And as the background was filled in, the story of the Emperor's rise and fall became part of the core, and the Great Crusade and the Astartes that fought in it were given greater detail. So arose the story of how Space Marines are made, and the fact that the model range was all male got incorporated into that story. The male-only Space Marine essentially is an artifact of market conditions for pewter models in the 1980s. Games Workshop has, of course, changed many things in the background since then, and expanded the scope of Warhammer 40k immensely. The company largely takes the line that the background is unreliable, so contradictions between different works can be seen as simply competing rumors or propaganda. Pretty much nothing has changed about this topic, with a few small exceptions. In the Black Library novels set in the Horus Heresy Scars, Malkador the Sigillite is far less convinced about the biological obstacles to making female Space Marines. He said to Rogel Dorn, "You brothers, such a nest of rivalries. I warned him to make you sisters, that it would make things more civilized. He thought I was joking. I wasn't." In a similar vein, Fabius Bile, in Josh Reynolds' fantastic Primogenitor, which is set between the Horus Heresy and the current timeline, said the following: "More than once I have questioned the Emperor's wisdom in bestowing his gifts upon but one half of the human race. For in man, as in all beasts, the female is the deadlier of the species. You're a thing of furious beauty, my dear, and never let anyone tell you different." We've also seen women upgraded using similar techniques to Space Marines in the Horus Heresy, receiving some of the enhancements in the same fashion as Luther or Corferon. An example of this is Submachine-Gun, who commanded one of the Caliban's greatest fortresses. While this isn't quite the same as being a full Astartes, it does show that there's an appetite among some of Black Library's authors to potentially tackle this topic. This is more or less how we find things now. Space Marines are officially male only, but the reasoning has become muddier, with the Emperor's contemporaries not necessarily convinced of the impossibility of female Space Marines. Add in that it's no longer the 1980s and the market is very different. In fact, if you look across GW's lines, there's been a marked effort to increase the diversity of their models, and one starts to wonder why it remains the company line. Age of Sigmar introduced the reanimated warriors of the God King Sigmar, the Stormcast Eternals, and while the initial run of sculpts were entirely male, with the release of Neve Blacktalon, we got the first female Stormcast, and have since received a variety of female Stormcast models. The forces of chaos, in the form of both Underworlds and Warcry warbands, have received a ton of fantastic female sculpts, many of which you will see in my conversions. And of course, Necromunda has seen a near endless variety of wonderful female models, though I do think that they have skimped a little bit on Cawdor and Goliath. They even finally added heads to the old Cadian Guard sprue, and it was kind of half-hearted, admittedly, because they were putting them in a 20-year-old set, but it was still a great advancement. And of course, Chaos got a ton of fantastic female sculpts in Blackstone Fortress, including Cultists and Traitor Guard. In my estimation, hobbyists are overall pretty happy with the state of Games Workshop's releases in terms of having a variety of options for models of different genders and even body types. It has felt like progress. It's in this context that over the weekend we saw the release of the passage in question that has caused so much conflict. Now, at core, this is nothing new. It's essentially the exact same justification that was given in previous publications. Considering our overall significantly better understanding of biology, though, we as a portion of the fandom are kind of tired of seeing it put in these terms. Including the blurb at all wasn't strictly speaking necessary, so people feel that it's Games Workshop doubling down on what they see as a bit of bad writing that doesn't really make sense. The fact that it also went over well with a certain segment of the fan base that GW would like to say will not be missed, well, it just gets kind of frustrating. This is not to say that the background in Warhammer 40k ever has to make sense. It's just that when you use biology as justification and it clashes with our own understanding of biology, it winds up creating a bit of doubt or cognitive dissonance on the part of the reader. The fact that the phrasing is so awkwardly non-specific and reminiscent of something that J.K. Rowling might have written in a screed struck people as Games Workshop betraying a promise to be for everyone. I don't personally think that it's really the right choice to attribute this passage to malice. I don't think that Games Workshop is endorsing gender-critical views or transphobia or anything like that. I try not to ever attribute to malice that can which be attributed to laziness, incompetence, or lack of forethought. But before we go any further talking about this, I think we're going to have to get a little bit scientific. Now, getting back to the statement in question, the process by which Space Marines are created relies inherently on the hormonal and biological makeup of the human male, meaning that only males can be subjected to the transformation. The primary complaint I've seen about this is that it does not align with contemporary understandings of human biology. Before anyone starts caps lock typing, I understand that Warhammer 40k is a science fantasy setting, and that it does not operate on the basic principles of the real world. At the same time, when you're writing background for a story and you justify something using vague terminology about biology, you're very likely to get pushback because biology is a real field of science and it can provide us with some illuminating information. about the topics of hormones and genetics in particular. 35 years ago, when Warhammer 40k was being written, general understanding of biology would not have included information about the complexity of human sex expression. Even today, there's a real gap between the state of science and popular understanding, as evidenced by the constant irritating arguments I see with transphobic people on various platforms. The first thing you need to know about human biology in the context of creating a space marine is that every human body is a product of both gene expression and hormones. Every human zygote, and all mammals for that matter, begin developing with the same biology. All of our body parts come from the same base organs that the zygote begins to produce when it implants. It's the introduction of hormones controlled by the zygote's SRY gene that results in the development of male genitalia. If this process were interrupted, the fetus would develop into a female, as that is how we develop by default. This isn't just a hypothetical either. There are humans born without the SRY gene, with XY gametes, and in these individuals, the body will continue to develop as female despite their Y chromosome, as the body doesn't receive the signal to develop male genitalia. The exact same biological components that would have become a penis and testicles will develop into a vagina and womb, but without ovaries. Given hormone therapy, these women develop entirely normal and are indistinguishable from women with two X chromosomes, beyond their lack of ovaries. Women with this condition have even given birth with a donor egg. The concept that we have distinct biology between sexes isn't really correct. We're made up of the same tissues, and the main differences in development are down to a complex combination of hormones. I've talked a few times in the past about the fact that I'm trans, but for my part, that means that I've had a rather first-hand understanding of the power of hormones in the human body. Last year, I was given a shot of Lupron, a drug that suppressed my testosterone production, and I began taking estradiol, a synthetic estrogen, that began to fundamentally change parts of my body. I've developed breasts, and my body has started redistributing fat and making a few other changes. This radical change is entirely the result of a simple switch in hormone levels between two hormones. My biology is changing to function in the same way as a woman's because my cells respond to hormones in exactly the same way as cis women's, because while I develop differently, the introduction of these hormones can fundamentally change how my body functions. Oh, and I actually feel like a person, which is a nice side effect. If the body responds to hormones the same way regardless, what about the biology of the human male, which I can only take to mean genetic differences, is causing this distinction? The long-running explanation in more detail was that the process of making Astartes involved the junk DNA on the Y chromosome. Genes, of course, are a fascinating concept as well, as it turns out you can edit them even in living adult humans. This is known broadly as gene therapy, and it's developed a great deal in the last 3 decades. One of the things we've learned is that we can systematically target changes to a patient's genome, essentially rewriting the instructions in their DNA. And guess what? Rewriting DNA is a core part of the process of creating a space marine. The gene seed of the Astartes is a collection of organs that perform advanced gene and hormone therapy on the host. The body is changed at a fundamental level to create the conditions necessary for a space marine to develop. Space marines are recruited as prepubescent children, and they're given essentially a superhuman puberty that causes them to develop into an Astartes. Our own contemporary understanding of biology leaves us wondering why the proper application of hormone therapy and gene therapy at the right time would not work on any human you've exposed it to. The explanation as written just comes across as lazy, particularly with how little detail beyond the maleness of the Space Marine is gone into. Instead, the language reminds people of the way transphobic individuals tend to talk about trans bodies. It's an extrapolation, but not by much, and that bothers people. That's a reason alone not to include this bit of information, or even, as I'll get into later, make a simple change. Space Marines are the most popular faction that GW sells, dominating both Warhammer 40k and the Horus Heresy, so they're a lightning rod for criticism at all times, and this topic has been simmering for pretty much this entire century. So GW making a direct statement on the topic was bound to create some reaction. Unfortunately, this has resulted in a lot of cheering from a certain crowd that GW has tried to distance themselves from, with past statements about Warhammer 40k being for everyone and being satire. But if the existing justification is bad, what about a different take? When this topic comes up, I generally see a few responses. The first is a kind of knee-jerk, lazy decrying of the idea as heresy and contradicting the lore and whining about people being PC or woke or whatever. This video isn't really about that. Those people are a lost cause, and trying to argue with their caustic, snarky online personas is a waste of everyone's time. They don't care about your arguments, they're just waiting for any opportunity to deploy the same overused memes, and they should not be engaged with. They want you to get mad at them. The block button is free, and frankly, trying to make arguments to someone who reveres the inconsistent slapdash collection of stories that is the lore of Warhammer 40k isn't a person you're going to reach under any circumstances. The most compelling argument against female Space Marines, in my opinion, has nothing to do with biology at all. Instead, it would root the decision to keep the Astartes program limited to males as part of the patriarchal worldview of the Emperor of Mankind. As I've seen many people argue, Warhammer 40k is a dystopian parody, an environment that would be considered hellish by anyone living in it, and setting that has always been described in terms that make it sound awful. There's no aspirational element to the fantasy of Warhammer 40k. It is instead humanity at its absolute worst, living in a galaxy populated with the absolute worst of every other species. There is a compelling case that in a dogmatic civilization created by such a self-obsessed, self-aggrandizing individual as the Emperor of Mankind, you would legitimately encounter strange sexist beliefs and practices that have no basis in biology, but which continue regardless of how they might hamper the ability to create another Astartes to protect mankind. It's a far more compelling argument for limiting the existence of female Astartes because there is plenty of precedent in human history for individuals to discriminate against women in ways that would ultimately be counterproductive. You need only look at the Soviet victory in World War II to see the power of unleashing the other half of your population in a war of attrition. The civilization of Warhammer 40,000, the Imperium does not understand much about the science and the process of making an Astartes. It's surrounded in mystery and is in many ways more of a ritual than a scientific act. It's even arguable whether the Emperor himself fully understood what he was doing in creating these superhumans. He's known to have involved many others working in his labs and relied on the direct intervention of the forces of chaos to create his Primarchs. This deal with the devil points to exactly how little control the Emperor had over his project in the end. Making Space Marines a boys' club would fit very well with the general awfulness of the Emperor of Mankind as he's depicted in the Horus Heresy series. I don't think as many people who would like to see the inclusion of female Astartes would be offended by this being the justification for the official lines continuing to exclude them. As a bare minimum, it is a better explanation for no Space Marines in Horus Heresy than what we received, and one that deepens the tones of the setting, making it more compelling and less forced. This also opens up the possibility that down the road, an aspiring young tech priest, perhaps one who's been experimenting on gene seed for the last 10,000 years, might find themselves creating a female Astartes like they created some from the forbidden gene seeds of the 9 Traitor Legions. But while this is a reasonable argument, and I think the people making it are doing so in good faith, it doesn't necessarily satisfy everyone's complaints. Fundamentally, the problem is that Space Marines occupy such a large portion of Games Workshop's attention that making the faction exclusively male rubs a lot of people the wrong way, even if the justification were to make internal sense. There are also other considerations. One of the most common responses when the topic of female Astartes comes up is, of course, that the Sisters of Battle exist as a sort of functional equivalent, a separate institution, but one that's recognizably similar to the Adeptus Astartes. The Sisters of Battle wear power armor into battle, they bear the Holy Bolt Gun, and their mission is relatively similar. They even ride in rhinos, the quintessential Space Marine vehicle. They are, from a broad view, essentially the female equivalent for Warhammer 40k of Space Marines. But again, I don't find this really all that compelling. The Sisters of Battle may have had their genesis as a sort of all-female Marine equivalent, but their role in the story is very different, with Space Marines as the default point of view so often in the universe versus the relative scarcity of media depicting the Adeptus. There's also the frequently thrown around, why not have male Sisters of Battle then response, which The multiple male units of the Sisters book notwithstanding, feels like a non sequitur because there is a compelling story reason why the Adeptas are all female. They're exploiting a loophole in the language surrounding the Ministorum's ability to raise armies. Since the prohibition of a fighting force referred to men under arms, the Sisters represent a parody of formalized dogma and how reinterpretation can radically alter the meaning of a passage. The original and continued all-female status of the Adeptas is due to a misinterpretation that was eventually accepted by all and formalized. It contributes to the feeling of bureaucratic hell that defines the Imperium, and I think that alone is worthy of not changing because it's one of the few in-game highlights of that part of the story. If GW had a compelling reason to change Sisters of Battle, it also wouldn't likely be met with the nearly as much vitriolic reaction as we've seen from the player base complaining about minimal changes required to allow female Astartes in the game. Of course, there's also the issue that while Marines have a sort of iconic but generic appearance, Sisters of Battle have a very specific aesthetic. These models wear highly stylized armor that is somewhat ridiculous, and not everyone is going to want to paint fleur-de-lis boob plate. The Sisters of Battle are unique, and I think they have a place in 40k, but there's a reason the orders aren't the poster children of the setting. Their gothic appearance is fixed, they don't have the breadth of interpretations that Space Marines have with their 1,000 chapters of different iconography and customs. Sisters of Silence also get brought up as an example of an all-female fighting force, and while they are kind of an army in the game, they have so little support that they don't even have their own book. They're basically there to give custodes some less expensive bodies. They're a formidable force in the background, but add in that they literally can't speak, and you get another faction that adds to the flavor and feel of the background, but which really doesn't address what people who are asking for female Space Marines want. And while Sisters of Battle have recently got a great range, it doesn't compare to the variety and options that Space Marines have, to say nothing of Sisters of Silence. Perhaps it shouldn't be that half the armies in the game are different flavors of Space Marine, but that's what the people want, so that's what GW gives us. And that means ultimately that female Space Marines will continue to come up until they have some sort of official support. There is a legitimate concern that the introduction of female Space Marines, if mishandled, would serve to continue to muddy the waters about the issue of the awfulness of the Imperium and distract from the overall depiction of the Imperium as a fascist hellscape. I say this is a legitimate concern because GW is pretty inconsistent about showing the darkness of the Imperium of Man, particularly when it comes to highlighting the heroic deeds of the fascist Imperium's super soldiers. I call this the girl boss problem for this situation because the 2010s saw a corporate and military-friendly push for women's inclusion that highlighted and celebrated women taking the reins of oppressive systems that hurt everyone but particularly women. This is neatly summed up in a satirical call for more women drone pilots or any other related violent, oppressive job that shouldn't exist. The call for more female Space Marines gets lumped into this criticism, but obviously it's kind of a different animal, as Warhammer isn't real life. It's a very different thing to want the super soldiers we're playing with to look like us. But I think the broader issue of how GW presents the Space Marine is worth considering. I think the introduction of female Stormcast actually demonstrates that GW is capable of a reasonable rollout of female super soldiers without falling into the cringe Yas Queen style tropes that some people worry about. The Space Marines can absolutely be presented as the monsters they would be while also being incredibly powerful and yes, even badass. The Hammer and Bolter episode Garden of Ghosts managed this perfectly, showing the point of view of the Space Marine victims and the horror at their brutality while also showing their power and prowess. In essence, this isn't an argument against female Space Marines at all, but an argument for the people writing the stories and the fans to be responsible about how we imagine our fascist space soldiers. Space Marines are monstrous, they should be terrifying, almost alien, cold, and cruel. At their core, female Space Marines should be equivalent to their male peers in this way. Weapons first and foremost. As I'll get to in the next segment, they may even be functionally identical to Space Marines who come from male aspirants. All of these things are compatible. This needn't be an argument against female Space Marines existing. Rather, it's an argument about people not turning them into power fantasies, which I think is entirely reasonable. Now that I've addressed why I'm not convinced by the main arguments against female Space Marines, we get to a deeper question altogether. Would Space Marines be any different if they were made from women? Do Space Marines experience something we could recognize as gender? I find these questions much more compelling than arguments against including female Space Marines because it gets to a more fundamental question. Would Space Marines made from girls, they're recruited as children after all, actually be very different from those made from men? We obviously don't have a clear canon answer, as previously noted in the biology section. The body would likely change immensely by the gene seed. It would basically overwrite the individual's normal puberty, and we can surmise that since bodies respond to hormones similarly, and the gene therapy that creates Astartes would change even their DNA on a fundamental level, that we might not readily tell an Astartes from a female aspirant from one made from a male aspirant. Add in a healthy dose of trauma and psychoconditioning, and you have a pretty uniform output. Astartes, something altogether different from the men and potentially the women aspirants that would have developed without intervention. This seems like a reasonable conclusion, and one thing I think we might find some agreement on, but it doesn't preclude our modeling and painting choices for female Marines, differentiating them, as the goal here is primarily more freedom for the hobbyist. Since we don't currently know what they would look like, people have taken inspiration from the female Stormcast, even using their heads for their conversions. The gruff and violent, but still recognizably female faces work perfectly. This is, I think, a good compromise on this issue, but of course we aren't done. There's a more fundamental question to resolve about Space Marines and gender. Do Space Marines experience something like gender? Or are they agender, or perhaps a neo-gender unto themselves? This is a complicated question, and despite the volumes of material produced by a Black Library that depicts an Astartes point of view, we don't necessarily have any concrete answers. Before we can go any further, it's necessary to define what we mean by gender. The World Health Organization describes gender as such. Gender refers to characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. This includes norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a woman, a man, a girl, or a boy, as well as relationships with each other. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. Now, Space Marines are interesting on a number of levels for a discussion of gender. They are, after all, engineered life forms. They're created from human stock, but their development is so different from that of their former peers that they're often characterized by the term transhuman. Once children, they have become something entirely else. They also undergo, as mentioned earlier, conditioning intended to make them fearless, incorruptible, and reliable battlefield combatants. This results in an Astartes having little in common with humans and creates a difficulty between the two reaching and relating to each other. In terms of the social roles and expectations, fashion, etc. of the Space Marine, there isn't really an equivalent in contemporary civilization. Space Marines are often compared to monks, but while the life of a monk is defined by the menial, the Space Marines are rather something altogether different. They're living weapons, blades honed for a single purpose. Their entire existence is based around making them better warriors. Even in the case of chapters where Marines are allowed individual artistic expression and output, this is in service of making them better fighters, rather than in the interest of fulfilling a human need. This, combined with the fact that they don't have children or generally mix with humans beyond the serfs and failed aspirants that populate their fortress monasteries and do all of the work and meet all of their needs, means it could very much be argued that Space Marines are agender, or alternately, that Space Marine is a gender itself. A compelling case could even be made that the various tactical roles fighters prefer, or the customs of a Space Marines chapter, make those the closest things that Space Marines experience to what we would define as our gender. Their chapter or battlefield role is their gender, essentially. There is, of course, also the angle that inevitably some of the past aspirants recruited as males have in fact been trans women, but after the gene seed and hypnosis, does their former self remain, or are they something different? How much of their childhood can an Astartes remember? How do they relate to what they can remember? Could they experience dysphoria? We know that Marine psycho-indoctrination is a powerful process, but we also know that it's a flawed process. Marines can become renegade, even traitor, so it isn't a foolproof system. Perhaps some Marines experience dysphoria, perhaps even severe dysphoria due to their mutated physique. When their hypnosis begins to break down, I could imagine an Astartes dealing with these issues. It's an angle I find personally fascinating, as I have some personal experience with dysphoria and not knowing what to call the feeling that I literally don't match up with who I see when I look in the mirror. And It would not surprise me if the average Space Marine chaplain has dealt with a few cases of an Astartes dealing with gender dysphoria. From this point of view, we can more or less surmise that of the millions of Astartes who have served the Imperium, at least some of them have been women, though they might not have had language to understand and communicate it, regardless of the biological requirements. Ultimately, though, these questions serve to sidestep the topic of female Space Marines. If female Space Marines would be functionally similar to male Space Marines, and the Space Marines themselves don't experience something that we could even relate to as gender, there's no real argument for excluding female aspirants or continuing with the bad justification that we currently have. The individuality of the Space Marine, how different any Space Marine is, of course, comes down to the views of the storyteller. It's malleable, and different authors have presented Marines in different ways. Hell, even the same author might depict Marines from different chapters as having radically different outlooks. And that is, I think, all the good faith criticisms that I've seen on this issue. They are reasonable positions to hold, and if they resonate with you, I don't think there's anything wrong with feeling that way. But ultimately, as I've noted, I don't think these are good enough reasons for Games Workshop to continue with their current take on the issue. And now we're left with the big question. Will this ever be resolved? I don't think that there's a simple resolution to the ongoing argument that we've been having about Space Marines. While I do think that we can literally disregard and dismiss the concerns of a bunch of caustic assholes that contribute very little to the hobby, it's hard to reconcile the good faith disagreements in a way that satisfies everyone. I think Games Workshop could, in the future, use the existence of the Primaris project to justify the release of female Space Marines. I also think that it would be entirely reasonable for them to set the issue aside and not comment either way on a potential viability of female Space Marines going forward, perhaps stating that the interpretation is up to the fans to decide. Not saying anything on the topic isn't really an option, though, since they've already made explicit comments about Marines being all male, so in a vacuum that is what a line that many hobbyists will continue to take. At a minimum, I would greatly prefer they retcon the background to explicitly make the source of the male-only aspects of the program rooted in the Emperor's prejudices. There's already plenty of setup for this. It would only require including his revelation in a Black Library book in the future. I personally would love for Games Workshop to officially acknowledge the existence of female Space Marines in the future, as I think it would immediately cause an uproar that would fade very quickly until the topic becomes a moot point. This already happened a number of times with Warhammer Fantasy and with the introduction of Primaris Marines. Many people were upset by the changes, but in time, the furor subsided and the story continued with the changes intact. We don't need Space Marines to be all male for any reason related to the story, and functionally we can do it in a way that isn't the sort of cringe depiction that people tend to assume female Space Marines would become if they were released. I think even more so it's important that we use the discussion as an opportunity to confront the fact that we all have, to some extent, conflicted with the background of Warhammer 40k at times, and ultimately it's up to the individual's views rather than the story unreliably told by Games Workshop that defines our modeling and storytelling choices. Part of this comes from playing Necromunda, where much of the background is ill-defined and left to the individual, but even the rules themselves are up for the discretion of the arbitrator, who's entrusted with the freedom to change things to work how they see fit in their campaign. If the rules themselves, far harder and less interpretive a product than the background, are malleable and subject to the needs of the individual, of course the background is just as changeable. Warhammer 40k was always intended to be a sandbox that you could play in. It was formulated to allow you as much freedom as possible. Warhammer 40k is, as I've said before, a katamari of genres and themes. It contains whatever it needs to and can change to fit the needs of the storyteller. These stories that now populate the background are mostly based on the armies the studio employees played and the battles they simulated that they enjoyed and wanted to incorporate into the background. There is nothing about the background of Warhammer 40k that is hard and fast. It's all up to the interpretation and needs of the storyteller, and we should be treating this as such for the purpose of creating our armies. This means that when there is a conflict between what we want and the lore, as it's so often called, Our needs take precedence, and people forget that at their own peril. There are purists who want to view that as heresy, and we should continue to treat those individuals as goofy weirdos and not give them the time of day. Personally, I just block them when they come out of the woodwork to comment on my page, and I know other people like to engage with them, but I would argue that it's a mistake. You're being abated, essentially, by these individuals, and they are depending on your acknowledgement to give their disagreement credence. As I've put it before, I'm not going to argue about whether there are female Space Marines. I know there are because I have an army of them. I'll discuss whether or how GW should deal with the topic, but I'm not interested in wasting my time and giving attention to the gatekeeper types. Let them shout into their empty void and hobby on. Now, when I made the point on Twitter that we should be less concerned with the official canon and more with our own creative projects, it resonated with a lot of people, and I even got retweeted by none other than Gab Thorpe of Black Library fame. But people did mention that the frustration of dealing with individuals who complain about things breaking the lore is a major issue. The gatekeeper weirdos are easy to ignore online, but when you run into them at your local game store or at an event, it's inevitable that there will be conflict. Ultimately, I think this is reason enough to want female Space Marines acknowledged by GW. It's the decent thing to do to ensure the least amount of bullshit from the asshole crowd that GW professes to not want to be associated with. If those individuals were not consistently such toxic assholes about it, I would say the choice of whether or not GW embraces female Space Marines is ultimately not that important, but that's not the case currently. Upsetting those douchebags is definitely worth a change that would ultimately not be that complicated or difficult to implement. Now that I've got on for a long time here, I wanted to get to the point where I started writing this video in the first place, as I generally try to avoid controversial topic du jour videos. Over the last few years, I have seen a number of extremely well-done projects of people producing their own female Space Marine models. The existence of these projects is an argument unto itself as to why the change would be great for the hobby. It's, in my opinion, that Games Workshop will, at some point at least, need to go out of their way to point out that the setting is primarily intended for us to have fun with, and that the official background should always be secondary to our enjoyment. This should be obvious, but an official statement on the topic would certainly allow Games Workshop a little bit more cred when it comes to their stance, that they embrace everyone, that they want to make the hobby welcoming for everyone. I took the opportunity to ask around on various social media platforms for folks who have made female Space Marines for the love of the hobby, and I have collected those here as a celebration of the exact sort of creativity that I think female Space Marines would unleash. I've even included some of my own. That's right, even though I'm not known for my love of loyalist Space Marines, I've officially begun a female Space Marine project. Last year, the sculptor behind Satyr Art Studios began hand sculpting and metal casting female Space Marine models in the Old Hammer style. As someone who adores the aesthetics of Old Hammer, who always wanted to get my hands on classic sculpts, this was a golden opportunity. I bought the first run immediately and even went online and bought a few classic GW models to fill out the project. As he sculpted more, I eventually purchased the whole range, and I wound up with enough for an army. So the last few days I've been working on assembling and painting my own female Space Marines project. I'm painting them up as Mantis Warriors in both sets of Rogue Trader colors. I'm very excited to finally be getting to work on them, and I even managed to actually get my hands on one of the two original female Space Marine sculpts, known as Female Warrior Jane. Though my effort to find Gabs has run into a wall of collector pricing for rare old models. If anyone has one available at a reasonable price, I would very much love to take it off your hands and incorporate it into my project. I'm also hoping to at some point find one of the old bizarre metal land speeders for the project, as well as another classic Land Raider, as my two are part of my Death Guard and not available. So here it is, the many, many amazing models sent to me when I asked the community to show off their stuff. I'm so grateful for everyone who contributed. I think it goes a long way to making my point that prioritizing fan creativity is the best way forward. I wish that I could say that I felt like this video resolves the conflict about female space marines that we see even in good comradely spaces, but unfortunately at no point will everyone be satisfied. I do however think that we can all be a little more gracious with each other and understanding while discarding the bad faith critics. The story of a game universe is, after all, not a good reason to fight with people you otherwise have a lot in common with. I know most people understand that implicitly, but unfortunately, not everyone does, and it needs to be said. Thanks to everyone who contributed images to the slideshow, and thank you to everyone who doesn't agree who's listened to the end. I don't need you to be convinced, but I hope that you understand why I thought this was worth doing an hour video on. As always, thanks to my patrons who helped me make this content. Anyone can become a patron for a contribution of as little as $2 a month, so check me out at patreon.com/DomeRunners, and of course don't forget about my podcast, The Dome Runners. I'm hoping to get a new episode up soon. I've had my hands full with other things, but now that I've finally made this, I think I can get the next episode done. And of course, everyone stay safe, and don't forget to change your paint water.